under the surface of the Earth, through one of the world's biggest man-made structures. Engineers call it one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The Channel Tunnel took 7 years to construct and devoured 1 million tons of concrete, enough to build the Empire State Building 3 times over. Europe. The nations of Britain and France. Since Ice Age glaciers melted 13,000 years ago, they've been separated by this formidable body of water, the English Channel. At 34 kilometres across, it's twice as wide as the Grand Canyon. The two nations spent hundreds of years at war, right up to the last century. For many on both sides, it's still a love-hate relationship. So the idea of an undersea tunnel to link these one-time foes caused controversy. But the massive trade boost for both countries was an irresistible incentive. In 1986, British Premier Thatcher and French Premier Mitterrand agreed to build the Channel Tunnel. But the total £3 billion budget was put up entirely by private finance. December 1987. The big dig begins. Heading underground were 2 armies of excavators, each over 4,000 strong, 1 French and 1 British. Each team would dig out from its own shoreline, racing to be the first to the midway point under the channel. The Brits were a tunnelling elite drawn from major worldwide underground projects. Calling themselves the Tunnel Tigers, they set great store by teamwork.
One-man armies don't go very far. You know, it takes quite a few lads to keep something like this going.
Commanding them is Chief Engineer Gordon Crichton.
You had a team who were totally dedicated to building the job.
The French digging team were the underdogs, locally recruited and trained up for the project.
It's the first time any of us have done a job like this. Everyone's proud to be involved.
Leading the French troops was Laurent Leblanc.
I couldn't believe I was actually working on such an exciting and colossal project. For me, it was absolutely incredible.
The Channel Tunnel would run twice as long underwater as any previous tunnel. The task facing the teams was huge. They had to dig 2 main rail tunnels, plus a central service tunnel, together as wide as a 4-lane motorway. 245 cross passages, crucial escape routes in the nightmare scenario of a fire or accident in the tunnel. Above the tunnels, vents to release the huge air pressure from speeding trains. And giant crossover caverns, allowing trains to divert from one tunnel to the other to allow for maintenance. It all added up to a staggering 153 kilometres of tunnel to be dug. As the dig began, the tunnellers were conscious of the vast scale and the real dangers of the task ahead. Above their heads, 100 metres of seawater and rocky seabed.
Every day you wonder what you're going into. There's only one way in and one way out.
Noisy, hot. You just think, what have I got myself in for, really?
Ahead of these tunnelling foot soldiers stood a 17 million-ton wall of earth and rock. It's not a job for claustrophobics. The job would push the men to the limit, but it would also make big demands on the technology of the day. Meet the tunnel boring machines. These underground leviathans spearheaded the Channel Tunnel dig. They were 200 metres long. That's the length of 2 football fields. They weighed 1,100 tons apiece, as much as a World War II destroyer. And they were twice as wide as a tank. Yet, as Gordon Crichton reveals, the way that TBMs work is surprisingly simple.
Imagine this is the bed of the channel. The machine is rotating underneath the sea, and as it rotates, the spoil from the tunnel is taken out the back, put into railway wagons and carried to the surface for disposal. Also, as it rotates, it erects a lining, a support round it, which is the permanent lining.
Expert tunneller Brendan Riley knew how central the TBMs were to the dig.
Basically, the machine is a mini factory. The factory is provided with power, it's provided with water, it's provided with electric, it's a workshop of the machine, preventive repairs. Basically, it's self-contained. It's got everything.
12 French and British TBMs excavated the tunnels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The TBM's high-tensile forged steel blades carved out 10 tons of rock with every turn. The biggest machines cost £10 million each, but as they've been specially designed for this one job, at the end they would simply be scrapped. The race between French and British tunnellers would be won or lost by their TBM's rate of progress. The Brits had the fastest machines, devouring up to 75 metres and 36,000 tonnes of rock a day. The French machines were 25% slower, but did have a key advantage. Their cutting heads were protected by a waterproof housing that allowed them to work on safely, even through waterlogged soil. 1 month into the tunnel dig, with the ground staying dry, the speedier British TBMs began to get ahead. Every day, hundreds of concrete slabs were shipped in to line the tunnel roof as it was dug. They were as big as a family car and 3 times as heavy. This is no ordinary concrete. Specially made to a recipe using granite, it's stronger than the stuff they use to build nuclear reactors. The TBM's powerful hydraulic arms pushed the slabs into place, forming the tunnel wall. The TBMs had to be kept supplied with slabs and constantly moving forward. British Chief Engineer Crichton knew that the schedule was tight. And with the tunnel's £1.3 billion budget all put up by private finance, government bailout was not an option. With the dig costing £1 million a day, each hour's overrun would add £40,000. By January 1988, the Anglo-French tunnelling race was hotting up. But the Brits were holding on to their lead. The rivalry underground is keeping the dig on schedule, but speed isn't everything. Success relies on keeping both tunnels precisely on target. If they stray off course, lives could be at risk. It's enough to daunt the boldest of engineers. The Channel Tunnel project, the longest undersea tunnel in the world. 2 rival teams of French and British workers were each digging out from their own shoreline. The plan, to meet midway under the English Channel. The tunnellers' goal was to win the race for the midpoint. But what kept the engineers awake at night was much more fundamental. The fear that the 2 tunnels wouldn't meet up. If the 2 tunnels missed each other, that would mean last-minute course corrections, which could create sharp bends. and the high-speed trains that would use the tunnel had to have a broadly straight course to operate safely. The margin for error was frighteningly slim. The tunnels could not deviate by more than 2.5 meters. Being off target was not an option. But lives were at stake too. If the massive tunnel boring machines strayed off course, they could hit waterlogged ground. The result could be disastrous. Flooding, or worse, tunnel collapse. It was imperative that the TBMs were guided along a safe and accurate route. That meant conducting one of the world's longest and most in-depth underground surveys. Rewind to August 1986, 18 months before tunnelling began. When surveyor Eric Radcliffe took on the job of plotting the tunnel's course, he knew the scale of the challenge he faced.
France, you can see over there, that's the French coast. So we had all that way to drive the tunnel and keep it online for that 38 kilometres. Actually, from here it doesn't look too bad, but it's a long, long way.
Plotting an accurate course over such a long distance underground is a surveyor's nightmare. In tunnels, the normal rules of surveying don't apply. Surveyors normally work by measuring a series of angles at control points along the route. It's all a matter of geometry. Above ground, with 360-degree visibility, plotting a course is relatively simple. Eric Radcliffe explains the difference.
The whole road is open to the air. All the survey control points from which you do the setting out are already established over the whole length.
Underground, there are obvious complications. All the surveyors can see is a wall of rock. They can't see ahead to plot the course. Roads have one other plus point over tunnels. Because they're flat strips on the landscape, they can only go off course in two directions: left or right. A tunnel occupies a three-dimensional space underground. It can go off course not only left or right, but also up or down. The two halves of the Channel Tunnel had 4 potential ways to miss meeting up. It's like asking a golfer to sink a hole-in-one blindfolded from 34 kilometres. To keep the tunnel on course and on target, the surveyors had to use a secret weapon: geology. Along its underground route, the tunnel would be driven through a layer cake of different soil and rock types with very different consistencies. The geologists needed one stratum that went right across the channel. This stratum would provide a trail to help keep the British and the French tunnellers on course. But it must be exactly the right type of rock for tunnelling. Jean-Luc Dessein was one of the geophysicists charged with tracing the perfect stratum for the tunnel to follow. On the French side of the channel, Dessein began his search. It would have to be waterproof to resist flooding, and compact enough so it wouldn't collapse during the dig. In these cliffs, Dessein found his prize. Water poured over this seam of rock without soaking in, evidence that it was waterproof.
With soft rock, impervious, so no water in the tunnel, this is a perfect situation for boring a tunnel.
It's called blue chalk. But it was one thing to identify the ideal rock, another to discover its course. Geologists drilled a series of boreholes into the seabed and dropped probes that fired sound waves deep underground. The aim, to measure changes of speed in the sound waves as they pass through different rock and soil layers. It sounds straightforward, but it wasn't.